Hello again and welcome back to Meeting Point English for another grammar lesson. And in this lesson we're talking about relative clauses. So to begin with, what is a relative clause? Now let's look at this sentence. My brother is a doctor. Here is another piece of information. My brother lives in London. So the relative clause is a way of incorporating two pieces of information into one sentence. Now, in this one you can see I've repeated my brother. My brother is a doctor. My brother lives in London. Now that's not a normal way of speaking. I would probably say my brother is a doctor. He lives in London. So I wouldn't have to repeat my brother. So he is a pronoun. Now to make a relative clause we need a relative pronoun. The relative pronoun when we're talking about people is who. So from he we get the relative pronoun who. So with this information I can make a sentence like this. My brother, who lives in London, is a doctor. So in this sentence I've got the main information, my brother is a doctor, and I've given you some additional information between the commas here. This is called a non-defining relative clause, and I'll explain later the difference between defining and non-defining. So I've given you extra information that he lives in London. Okay, my brother, who lives in London, is a doctor. If I think the fact that he lives in London is more important, I might phrase it like this and say my brother, who is a doctor, lives in London. And in this one, the secondary additional piece of information is who is a doctor. So this is two ways of giving the same information using relative clauses. Here's another example. Goldfish are popular pets. Goldfish come from China. And again, I'm repeating goldfish, so let's change that and say they come from China. Now in the last one, I used who as my relative pronoun because I was speaking about people. I was talking about my brother. But in this one, I can't use who because I'm talking about fish. So I will probably use which as my relative pronoun. When I talk about things, animals and objects, I would use which. So again, I can make a sentence using a relative clause, like this. Goldfish, which are popular pets, come from China. And again, my main piece of information is that they come from China. The secondary piece of information, the additional information, is that they are popular pets. So goldfish, which are popular pets, come from China. Or I could say goldfish, which come from China, are popular pets. Now here's a more complicated one. In this sentence I'm talking about my neighbour. My neighbour is having a party. In this sentence, my neighbour's daughter has passed her exam. Now, if I want to change my neighbour to a pronoun, I would say he is having a party or she is having a party. But the second sentence here, I've got my neighbours as a possessive form. So I wouldn't say he or she. I would say his or her daughter has passed her exam. Okay, so I can't use who. I need the possessive relative pronoun, whose. And I get this sentence. My neighbour, whose daughter has passed her exam, is having a party. So whose is a possessive relative pronoun. Now let's get back to this. Are the relative clauses defining or non-defining? This is the difference. The man who lives next door is from Scotland. In this sentence, I am defining the man next door. I think you need this information to know which man I am talking about. Okay, so I'm defining the man. So you'll see when I'm using a defining relative clause, there are no commas. The man who lives next door is from Scotland. I'm specifying which man I am talking about. In this sentence, Albert Einstein, who was born in 1879, is one of the world's most famous scientists. I presume that you know who Albert Einstein is. He's quite famous. There are not many Albert Einsteins in the world. Unless you have a neighbour called Albert Einstein, or you are studying in class with another Albert Einstein, or you work with another Albert Einstein, I think there's only one. So we don't really need to specify which Albert Einstein we're talking about. So this phrase between the commas is non-defining. The phrase who was born in 1879 is not specifying which Albert Einstein we're talking about. It's purely extra information, and it comes between the commas. Now let's get back to my brother. My brother, who lives in London, is a doctor. In this one, this is a non-defining clause. I'm not specifying my brother. I'm just giving you extra information about my doctor brother. Yeah? My main information is my brother is a doctor. The extra information is that he lives in London. Now this one, without commas, is a defining clause. So if I say, my brother who lives in London is a doctor, I'm specifying which brother. So if I use this sentence, it might be that I have a brother in Manchester and another brother in Paris and another brother who lives in New York. This one is specifying which brother I'm talking about, whereas in the first sentence, I presume that you know which brother, and I'm only giving extra information. So both of these are possible. Now, when we're using defining clauses, there are lots of variations in the way we write them. So as we've seen before, the man who lives next door is from Scotland. There's my defining clause. And sometimes when we do defining clauses, who can change to that. Some people say the man that lives next door is from Scotland. It's slightly more informal, but quite often who or which can change to that. The man who I was speaking to is from Scotland. And again, the man that I was speaking to is from Scotland. But in this one we have an extra option. The man I was speaking to is from Scotland. So why is it that in the previous sentence we had two options, who or that, but in this sentence we have the extra option of removing that and just saying the man I was speaking to is from Scotland? Well, let's look at the first sentence again. The man who lives next door, the man that lives next door. The second sentence, the man who I was speaking to, the man that I was speaking to, or the man I was speaking to. Well, you need to look at the verb lives in the first sentence. Who is the agent of that verb? The man lives, yeah? He is the subject of that verb. The man lives. Whereas in the second sentence, I was speaking. You'll see that the verb speaking here has a different subject. I've introduced I as the subject for that verb. The man I was speaking to. So when the following verb in the relative clause has a different subject, you can remove the relative pronoun. The man I was speaking to is from Scotland. There's another option here. We can also have the man to whom I was speaking. Whom is also a relative pronoun, but it's used for the object. Okay, so in this one, this is a very formal way of speaking, and not many people will actually speak like this anymore, but you might hear it in very formal contexts, or some older people, or in those very formal situations. You sometimes hear the man to whom I was speaking is from Scotland, but it's not very common. And you'll see that the to has moved its position from speaking to. The to has moved into the central position, the man to whom. But as I say, it's very formal and you probably won't need this structure. So there are a few variations, but don't forget, if you use who, you don't have to worry about whether it can change to that or whether it can be removed. You can leave that to the native speakers, and if you just keep with who, you'll be fine. Here's another example. The girl who works in Paris sent me a letter. The girl that works in Paris sent me a letter. But in this one, the girl whom I met, because she's the object, that sounds very formal to me. The girl who I met sounds more normal, or slightly more informal. The girl that I met, or indeed in a very informal situation, I can remove that altogether because it's got I met. You see again, there's a new subject for the verb met. I met in Paris. So I don't need the relative pronoun at all, and in informal situations I will remove it completely. The girl I met in Paris sent me a letter. So that's really everything you need to know about relative clauses, but there are some more complications. If you think it's complicated so far, you can stop watching now and come back to this part later. But it's getting a bit more complicated. There are some more details that you might need to know if you are a more advanced learner. So let's look at these sentences. She bought the gun. He shot the rabbit with the gun. He shot the rabbit with it. I change the gun to it. And then we can change it to which. Now what we're concerned with is what we do with the preposition with. There are various ways we can do this. Now the more formal way of doing things is to move with to that middle position in front of which. She bought the gun with which he shot the rabbit. Now this is very important for formal speech. Most people don't do this. We tend to leave with at the end of the sentence and say this: she bought the gun which he shot the rabbit with. That's a much more normal way of speaking. Now if we've got the more informal way with leaving with at the end, then the which might change to that. The first sentence, with which, that which cannot change. Okay, don't try saying with that, doesn't work. Okay, if you keep the with at the end, then which he shot the rabbit with can change to that he shot the rabbit with. And even we might remove it. So she bought the gun he shot the rabbit with. Again, we've introduced he shot. We've got a new subject in there, so we can remove it. So you see there are variations. Even though all of these sentences mean the same, they are in order of formality here. So depending in the context, you can say it in different ways. I think probably the second option is going to be the more common. Now let's look at this, which or where. Sometimes we are talking about a place as if it is only an object, and sometimes an object can be a place. What do I mean by that? Let's look at some examples. I went to Sheffield. Sheffield is in the north of England. Okay, this is information about the city of Sheffield. So I'm only describing the city. Whereas in this sentence, they make knives in Sheffield, I'm talking about an activity that takes place in that city rather than just describing the city. So I could make relative clauses like this. I went to Sheffield, which is in the north of England. You'll see I'm using which because I'm treating Sheffield as if it were any other object. I'm just describing it, giving you some information about the city, rather than this sentence, I went to Sheffield where they make knives. I'm treating it much more as a place, as a location for the making of knives. So in the first sentence, I'm only describing it as any other object, so I'm not talking about it as a place. Whereas the second one, because they make knives in Sheffield, it's much more of a place, so I'm using where. Here's another example. If I talk about a cupboard, you might think a cupboard is just an object. I bought the cupboard in IKEA. You see, it's just an object. But if I keep my books in the cupboard, then the cupboard suddenly is a place. So I might have sentences like, this is the cupboard which I bought in IKEA, or that I bought in IKEA, or I bought in IKEA. But this is the cupboard where I keep my books. So if I'm referring to it as a location, as a place, then I'll use where rather than which. So you see there is a bit of flexibility between what is an object and what is a place. Let's do some more complex sentences to do with our IKEA cupboard. So this is the cupboard. I keep my books in the cupboard. Now if I want pronouns here, I could say I keep my books in it, using the preposition and the pronoun. So if I were to change that to a relative pronoun, I would have which. But then I got in as my preposition, in which. Or, instead of in the cupboard, changing to in it, I could change the whole thing to there because it's a place. I keep my books there. The relative pronoun from there is where, which means that I have quite a wide variety of options with my relative clauses. So I could say, this is the cupboard where I keep my books. That's quite a neutral way of saying it, using where, because the cupboard is a place. But I could also say, this is the cupboard in which I keep my books, with in the central position again, so it's more formal. Or I can leave in at the end of the sentence or at the end of the clause. This is the cupboard which I keep my books in, slightly more informal. And if I've got my preposition at the end there, separated from the which, then I can change that which to that. This is the cupboard that I keep my books in. And of course it's I keep my books, so I have the other option of having no relative pronoun. This is the cupboard I keep my books in. So there you go, we've got a whole range of different ways of saying the same information. What about what, I hear you ask? A lot of people think we can use what in these situations. Well, sometimes you can, but it's quite complicated. What is not a relative pronoun, okay? What is something else? It's called a nominal relative pronoun, which means that it takes the place of the noun and the relative pronoun. It's sort of a noun-relative pronoun combination, and it often leads to confusion. So here's some examples of really when you don't use it. I liked the story which she told me. So that which, can we change it to that? Well, it's a defining clause, so we must be able to say, I liked the story that she told me. Yeah. Now, can we remove it? Yes, we can, because we've got she told me, the verb told there. She told me. I liked the story. She told me. But we cannot do this. Okay? Remember, what is not a relative pronoun. You might hear people speaking like this, but at the moment it's not considered a very educated way of speaking. So if you listen to footballers being interviewed after the football match, they often use this kind of structure. It's actually quite common, but it's very, very informal and considered quite a bad way of speaking at the moment. If you look in a grammar book in 50 years' time, it might be considered correct, but at the moment of making this video, it's a very bad way of speaking. So what is what? As I said, what is a nominal relative pronoun, which means it takes the place of the noun and the relative pronoun. So this is how it's used. I liked what she told me. Okay, so you can see the story is incorporated into what. So you can't say the story, what she told me. You can only say I liked what she told me. So it's taking the form of the noun and the relative pronoun together. Okay, so be careful with what. Okay, so I think that's everything you need to know about defining and non-defining relative clauses. Hope you enjoyed that. I hope everything is clear, and I'll see you in the next video.